In sunny Florida, from behind the palms, a monster unleashes appalling violence.
What they found, grown men got physically sick.
When detectives probe further, they enter a depraved killer's twisted mind.
I never thought that I would be that close to someone who was capable of doing those things.
And most shocking of all, he's one of their own.
He's one of the most extreme cases of the modern serial killer that we have ever known in criminal history.
Martin County, Florida. The Sunshine State's hidden gem is blessed with miles of beautiful beaches lapped by crystal clear waters.
Those of us that live here call it paradise because it's laid back. It's summer, 12 months out of the year. So you can just come here and be yourself.
In the 1970s, young Americans flock here to soak up the sun and enjoy its relaxed atmosphere.
Young people would come here simply because it was an oasis for them.
The mix of fun-loving tourists and law-abiding locals makes for a peaceful life.
Compared to many other places in Florida, it was fairly calm and quiet. We didn't have rampant crime, so it was a good place to be a law enforcement officer.
One man sworn to serve and protect the people of Martin County is Sheriff's Deputy Gerard John Schaefer. He's a recently married 26-year-old college graduate and one of the sheriff's most promising new recruits.
We were looking for educated young law enforcement officers who could get along well with the public, and Schaefer made a pretty good appearance. He looked passable in the uniform.
A trained cop, Schaefer transferred from nearby Wilton Manors PD, with glowing references following a drugs bust.
He had a letter of recommendation from his previous chief praising him for some work he had done. So we did hope that he would fit well and work well.
And there's one more thing that makes Schaefer an ideal candidate. He's a local boy with intimate knowledge of Martin County's wild countryside.
This area at that time period was very remote, but Schaefer knew the area. It seemed reasonable to hire this well-respected young man to become a deputy sheriff.
With intelligent young deputies patrolling the area, Martin County's reputation as a small piece of paradise looks assured. But in the summer of 1972, shocking news shatters its tranquility. July 22nd. Sheriff Crowder receives a phone call. It's from his new recruit, Deputy Schaefer.
I'm sorry, boss.
And he sounds worried.
Yeah, I've done something foolish.
He told me basically, he says, "You're really going to be mad at me. I've really messed up. I've done something very stupid."
Schaefer tells his chief he'd wanted to teach two female hitchhikers about the dangers of accepting lifts with strangers. But in trying to do the right thing, he's overstepped the mark.
I was trying to teach them a lesson.
He told me he took the girls into the woods and tied them up. He left them there so that they would feel some fear. I've never had anyone call me and tell me things like that before.
Schaefer says when he went back to check on the hitchhikers, they'd disappeared. He's in big trouble, and he knows it. Crowder orders Schaefer straight back to the sheriff's department and heads out to search for the girls. Nothing prepares him for what he's about to discover. Out on Hutchinson Island, Crowder finds the girls running for their lives. They are terrified.
When I got out to that area, they were almost hysterical. I just cannot help but believe they actually feared that they were about to die.
Oh my God!
Deputy Schaefer's claim he was only trying to scare the girls is clearly not the full story.
Right now.
It was certainly much more sinister than the little rendition that Schaefer had given me over the telephone.
The girls are two friends on holiday, 17-year-old Nancy Trotter and 18-year-old Paula Wells. They explain that the day before they were hitching a ride to the beach when they encountered Deputy Schaefer.
No, I know there's a lot of creeps around here. You gotta be careful. You're lucky that,
The cop warned them taking lifts from strangers is dangerous.
I'll pick you up.
To keep them safe, he offered to drive them to the coast himself the next day.
These two girls trusted a man in uniform. He's charming, he's charismatic, and they know nobody in this town. So they agree.
But Nancy and Paula's safety was the last thing on Schaefer's mind. The girls tell investigators that the following day the deputy turns up as promised. But he's driving a civilian vehicle and is not in uniform. Schaefer explains he's working undercover.
It's special observations. Nothing to worry about. Just get in the back, yeah?
Reassured, Nancy and Paula get into his car.
You all set?
They don't head to the beach as promised. Instead, Schaefer drives them to a remote part of Hutchinson Island, where he subjects them to a terrifying nightmare. He slaps handcuffs on the girls
Right now. Eyes forward. Come straight ahead.
and forces them into the dense undergrowth to a spot he has specially prepared.
After he tied their hands, he tied a noose around their necks and tied that to the limbs of the tree.
Schaefer forces Nancy and Paula to balance on the mangrove tree's slippery roots. One misstep and they'll die.
If one of those girls had tripped and fallen off the way he had them perched on these roots, she could very easily have been killed.
While the girls' lives hang in the balance, Schaefer torments and molests them. Then, suddenly he departs, leaving the hitchhikers balancing on the roots. Before he goes, he tells the pair what will happen to them when he returns.
Schaefer told the girls that he would be back later to finish the job. And he told the girls that one of them would die. They just had to decide which one.
Incredibly, Nancy and Paula managed to wriggle free of the nooses. They run for their lives.
Had these two girls not been made of strong stuff, they would not have lived to tell the story, and Schaefer would have never been caught.
Sheriff Crowder immediately fires his deputy and arrests him for abduction and aggravated assault. Schaefer is released on bail, his trial date set for 4 months' time. How could the promising deputy have done something so twisted?
I never thought that in my career I would be that close to someone who was capable of doing those things that are pretty shocking and naturally very serious. I was certainly upset with him. I mean, how could you not be?
November 1972. Schaefer stands trial for the imprisonment and assault of Nancy and Paula. Despite the severity of the crime, he's allowed to strike a deal, pleading guilty for a shorter sentence.
As serious as the charges against Schaefer were, they were not serious enough, just the kidnapping and assault, to prevent him from participating in a plea bargain.
Schaefer's negotiations succeed. He'll spend just 6 months in the county jail.
My feeling was that he got off lighter than he should have, but we had to make the best of how our system works.
And he asks for one more concession: a bail extension, so he can relocate his wife to his mother's house in Fort Lauderdale.
Because he was a cop and because Schaefer had no record, he was blemish-free, the judge said, take care of business and show up in January to serve your sentence.
In total, Schaefer has 6 months of freedom before going to jail. But the judge has no idea he's given the former deputy a perfect window of opportunity to satisfy the darkest urges of his twisted mind and commit the most depraved acts of violence. April 1st, 1973. St. Lucie County, Florida. 2 men collect rubbish on Hutchinson Island. They hope the discarded cans will fetch a good price at the recycling center. But little do they know, today, they'll find more than they bargained for. In the twisted undergrowth, they make a shocking discovery.
God, it's a body!
The heavily decomposed remains of 2 young women.
What they found at this site, grown men got physically sick. The bodies had been hacked to pieces and then buried in shallow graves, and then the wildlife had dug them up.
We've got to find someone.
Local detectives rush to the scene. It's impossible to tell when the victims were killed or how long their remains have lain undiscovered.
In the state of Florida, Between the humidity and the heat, bodies will decompose within 24 to 48 hours. And when I say decompose, you have to use a shovel to pick them up.
But there is enough evidence to piece together how the women died. Their arms are bound with the remnants of rags. Their bones show signs of knife cuts. And on a nearby tree, investigators discover something unusual. The impressions of thick ropes.
The only reasonable explanation for the marks was from someone with a noose around their neck trying to balance to keep from being killed via hanging.
Detectives are certain the young women suffered a terrible fate. They had been tied up, put in nooses, and then slaughtered.
It was the absolute worst crime that the investigators had ever seen in this county.
To discover the victims' identities, detectives analyzed the evidence. Jawbone fragments match the dental records of 17-year-old Susan Place and her friend, 16-year-old Georgia Jessup. Their clothes are also recovered from the scene. Why anyone would murder these girls is a mystery. Searching for leads, investigators question Susan's and Georgia's parents. Susan's mother, Lucille, last saw the girls 6 months ago. They were picked up from her home in Fort Lauderdale by a man in his 20s called Gerard Schaefer.
Lucille had her doubts about this Gerard Schaefer, but Jerry assured her that he would not hurt the girls, that he would take very good care of her daughter, that his intentions were noble.
When the girls failed to return home, their mothers turned sleuth. Among Georgia's possessions, they found a letter she'd written to Shepherd that had been returned to sender.
The letter gives Shirley and Lucille an address to start the investigation of where their daughter might be. I mean, for all they knew, the girls were still alive. They had just run away.
The mothers tell investigators they traveled to Shepherd's apartment 130 kilometers away in the town of Stewart, and soon discovered he was not who he had claimed to be.
They meet the apartment manager, and the apartment manager explains to them that there's no Gerard Schaefer there, that the person that lives there is Gerard John Schaefer.
The manager then revealed why Schaefer no longer lived at the address.
The manager says that he is in jail for molesting 2 young women on South Hutchinson Island.
Lucille and Shirley's detective work connects former Sheriff's Deputy Gerard John Schaefer to their daughter's murders. He is serving time in prison for the kidnap and assault of hitchhikers Nancy Trotter and Susan Wells 8 months earlier. Investigators immediately recognize similarities between the ordeal they endured and the slayings of Georgia Jessup and Susan Place.
The difference in the 2 crime scenes is that Susan Place and Georgia Jessup were executed. Trotter and Wells got away, but there was a pattern, with Schaefer being common denominator.
But to convict Schaefer of the murders, detectives know they'll need physical evidence linking him to Georgia and Susan. The former cop's wife, Teresa, provides the connection. She says her husband gave her a present shortly after the girls disappeared.
She tells the police that she does have this beautiful suede bag that Schaefer had allegedly given her as a gift. And after the two girls were found, Schaefer tells her to get rid of it.
It's soon clear why Schaefer told his wife to throw it away.
Georgia's mother says, I gave her that bag for her birthday. Why would Schaefer be in possession, and how did he get it?
There can be only one explanation. Schaefer took it as a memento of a horrific crime. After gaining the girls' trust, Schaefer kidnapped them, tied them up, put nooses around their necks, and tortured them.
It's a very chilling scene. It keeps me awake at nights. You have a man torturing you, saying things like, one of you decide which one's gonna die. I'll let the other one go.
After slaying the girls, Schaefer butchers them and buries their remains to cover his tracks. But this scenario has a crucial flaw. Schaefer seems to have the perfect alibi. When Susan and Georgia's bodies are discovered, Schaefer is behind bars for kidnapping.
The question is, how could Schaefer have committed the second crime when he's been in jail since January 1973? It's impossible for him to be in two places at once.
But there is a window of opportunity during which he could have carried out the murders.
I do. God bless. Okay, have a good evening, yeah?
Susan's mother says Schaefer picked up the girls on September 27th, 1972.
All right, you all set?
2 months after he was released on bail. A chilling realization dawns on investigators. During his 6 months of freedom before being locked up, Schaefer turned killer.
He got his wife situated, he got his affairs in order, and he committed an execution.
September 27th, 1973. Gerard John Schaefer stands trial for the murders of Susan Place and Georgia Jessup. The jury's verdict is unanimous. Guilty. The judge sentences Schaefer to 2 consecutive life terms in prison. But Florida's homicide detectives suspect they haven't heard the last of him. The unique way Schaefer kills suggests Susan and Georgia were not his first victims.
He had experience doing this, he had skills in doing this, and he'd probably been doing it for a while. It would seem extremely unlikely that John Schaefer only ever killed 2 women.
Acting on their theory, detectives hunt for clues connecting Schaefer to missing persons cases across Florida. They learn, before his incarceration for the kidnap of Susan Wells and Nancy Trotter, Schaefer moved his personal belongings to his mother's house. There, investigators make a series of shocking discoveries. Hidden in a box is a collection of disturbing stories handwritten by Schaefer. Grim tales describing sickening violence against women, many with grotesque illustrations.
They were filled with hate, sexual violence, pornographic writings that would make even the most hardened human being violently ill.
It's possible they're fantasies, merely the imaginings of Schaefer's warped mind. But investigators notice a troubling theme.
In all of the stories, Schaefer talks about nooses, tying the victims up, torturing them, just mentally breaking down his victims to nothing.
Is it possible Schaefer's writings are not just stories, but accounts of real murders? His way of remembering past crimes. Detectives are about to discover they've only scratched the surface of Schaefer's depravity. Buried in his past is a trail of horrific crimes that could make him one of the most prolific serial killers in American history. Investigators sift through the possessions of former sheriff's deputy and convicted murderer Gerard John Schaefer. They're looking for evidence that connects him to the disappearances of women across Florida. Carefully concealed in Schaefer's room is a container filled with personal items. Jewelry, including a small gold locket and a distinctive brooch. They don't belong to any women in Schaefer's family.
Why would Schaefer have earrings and necklaces and other paraphernalia that did not belong to his wife or his mother? Coincidence? I think not.
Detectives link the items to 7 unresolved cases of missing women filed over the past 4 years. It's strong evidence Schaefer is a practiced killer.
The fact that investigators found so many of these trinkets and trophies in Schaefer's home, it would lead us to believe he likely couldn't control himself and only stopped at doing this twice. It would seem very rational that he was a serial killer.
And when detectives share the evidence from Schaefer's trinket box with officers in neighboring counties, the number of potential victims more than trebles.
Other police officers from other states started calling in saying, "We've got this missing girl. Do you have anything on her? Could it be Schaefer?" It added up real quickly to at least 32. At least 32.
Schaefer must answer for these newly discovered crimes. But the evidence is merely circumstantial. Without the victims' bodies, securing justice will be impossible.
Because there were no bodies to tie him to any of these cases, the prosecutors could not go back and try to convict him. There was a fear that those cases would never be solved.
Investigators must wait 16 years before a surprise intervention finally unlocks Schaefer's bloody past. February 1989, Florida State Prison. Schaefer receives a letter from an author called Sondra London. She's fascinated by his story and his graphic accounts of murdering women. She wants to write a book about his crimes, exploring the inner workings of a killer's mind. Schaefer agrees to collaborate. But Sondra's interest is more than just professional. It's deeply personal. She knew Schaefer back in high school. He was her boyfriend.
How could you know someone so very well, so intimately, for so long, and have absolutely no idea that they have a separate life of sex and violence and depravity, and you have no clue?
Back in 1964, Schaefer seemed the perfect catch.
He's tall, good-looking, blonde hair, blue eyes, and he showed every sign of having every social skill that you could want.
But as their relationship developed, Sondra's blue-eyed boy revealed glimpses of his dark side. On one occasion, he flew into a rage over a girl on his street. He believed she was taunting him by stripping in her bedroom window.
And he said, that's where Lee Hainline undresses for me. She knows I'm watching. And he said, I'm gonna put a stop to that. I will never forget the emotion that was bound up there.
Sondra didn't realize her boyfriend put women into two distinct groups.
Schaefer classified people into two categories: virgins and whores. Anyone who he could see flaws in, you were a whore, and he would find you perfect target to use for his dark secrets, for his torture and murder.
And Schaefer considered the girl in the window, Lee Hainline, no virgin.
All of a sudden, Lee became a whore. Lee became somebody that he absolutely hated. Lee disappeared.
Lee went missing in 1969. Police find no trace of her for 9 years. Then her skull is discovered in a canal north of Fort Lauderdale. It is punctured with bullet holes. When investigators cross-reference their evidence files, they make a shocking discovery. Among the personal items found in Schaefer's trinket box was a locket engraved with a distinctive name: Lee.
Her name was spelled oddly. It was spelled Leigh. And her parents did ID that the locket was indeed hers. Taking all of that circumstantial evidence together, it could be possible that Schaefer murdered Lee.
If Schaefer did kill her, it means he was already a murderer before he became a police officer. When Sondra learns Lee's fate, she's stunned. She realizes at any point in their relationship, Schaefer could have killed her.
I remembered him being angry at me, and that could have been me.
As with the other missing women, Lee Hainline's remains do not yield any evidence linking the former sheriff's deputy to her murder. For the time being, Schaefer is untouchable, and he knows it. "20 years after Lee's slaying, Sondra sits down with her former boyfriend.
You got my letter, and
It's clear he still revels in the misery he's inflicted on his victims. Confident the authorities will never connect him to the crimes.
I asked John, do you still write those stories that you got arrested for? And he wrote back, boy, do I.
Behind bars, Schaefer scrawls graphic tales of torture and murder. Just like the stories investigators discovered in his mother's house years earlier. Now that he's sat in front of an author, he sees an opportunity to publish them for the whole world to read and bask in the evil glory of his infamous crimes. He bombards Sondra with pages and pages of sickening text.
He tried so hard to shock me and disgust me. He started sending me these stories that were vile, absolutely vile. What he was prevented from perpetrating in person, he perpetrated with the pen.
Details from his stories match how investigators believe Georgia Jessup, Susan Wells, and Lee Hainline were murdered. It's as if Schaefer is writing his confession.
Schaefer wrote his stories in the first person, where he's describing it in such a way where he himself can put himself there. It's an extension of reality for him. He's so sadistic, and he's gotten the torture and the pain and the mutilation so well tuned in, make you think it's not just a lunatic writing these.
But Schaefer is careful and crafts his words so as not to incriminate himself. His twisted diligence pays off. When Sondra publishes Schaefer's writings, investigators fail to extract any evidence that could lead to his conviction for more murders.
You can logically place Schaefer at those crime scenes. However, there is no physical evidence to place him at those crime scenes, except for the book that he says is fiction.
It appears Gerard John Schaefer may never be held accountable for the pain, torture, and murder investigators believe he's perpetrated. But Schaefer's story is not finished. His arrogance will ultimately prove his undoing and expose the horrifying scale of his evil. June 1989. In Florida State Prison, former sheriff's deputy and suspected serial killer Gerard John Schaefer taunts detectives. They believe his handwritten stories are accurate accounts of more murders he's committed. But Schaefer claims they are works of fiction, and investigators can prove nothing.
Schaefer thinks like a cop. And in thinking like a cop, it's a cat and mouse game with him. He has control of the situation, and he's playing these cops for fools and loving every minute of it because he is God.
But in time, Schaefer's arrogant gloating will backfire. After Sondra London publishes her book about Schaefer's stories, he begins writing her revealing letters. In one, he claims his story, Murder Demons, describes how he killed two 14-year-olds, Mary Briscolina and Elsie Farmer.
This is the kind of thing that he would write me. What kind of crimes am I supposed to confess to? Farmer, Briscolina? What do you think Murder Demons is? You want confessions, but you don't recognize them when I anoint you with them. And we've just gotten started.
Mary and Elsie were last seen alive on October 23, 1972. Construction workers uncovered their skeletal remains 3 months later near Fort Lauderdale. From the start, detectives suspected a link to Schaefer. Mary Briscalina's distinctive brooch was one of the many women's personal items found in Schaefer's bedroom. In his letter to Sondra, Schaefer has hinted for the first time that he is responsible for their deaths. And his sickening claims don't end there. He is suspected of 32 murders, but boasts it's just the tip of the iceberg.
Schaefer liked to pretend that he was, quote unquote, the greatest serial killer of women in this century. And my challenging him with this brought this response from him. I'm not claiming a huge number, he says. I'd say it runs between 80 and 110.
Reflecting on the shocking details of Schaefer's letters, Sondra realizes the former deputy has finally slipped up. The letters are admissions of guilt, and she must hand them over to investigators.
I began to reach the conclusion that I had in my hand actual murder confessions, no matter what he called them, and that there were going to be a lot of cases that might possibly be able to be closed.
Schaefer's correspondence with Sondra stuns detectives. After careful analysis of the letters, they reopen 3 cases of missing women they suspect Schaefer of killing. Detectives plan to confront him with his own words, get him to crack, and reveal the whereabouts of his missing victims.
This would give the families closure. They would understand that their children will never come home. And with all of these cases, the mothers always had hope.
On Friday, December 1st, 1995, they arrange with Florida State Prison to interview Schaefer the following week. But any hope of justice is about to be dealt a bitter blow.
On Monday, they get a call from the prison saying, "Don't bother coming up here. Schaefer has met his demise." If I were the detective on the other end of that phone, my heart and my stomach would hit the floor.
The day before, Schaefer was brutally attacked by his cellmate for ratting out his fellow prisoners.
He stabbed Schaefer 18 times in each eye. He cut Schaefer from his left ear to his right ear across his mouth. The message is, snitches no longer see, snitches no longer talk, snitches die.
Investigators' hopes of recovering the missing victims have been dashed.
Schaefer has the last laugh. Schaefer carries to the grave confessions, maybe where the bodies were. Lots of anger, because we're right back where we started. Cold cases that will probably never be closed now.
But for some, his brutal death is a fitting end to a despicable man.
When I found out that Schaefer had been killed, it was like a horrible stink had just drifted out the window, and for the first time in years, I could breathe fresh air.
When he joined the Martin County Sheriff's Department, Gerard John Schaefer looked every inch a model law enforcement officer. Handsome, intelligent, dedicated. But behind his badge lurked a cruel murderer. His crimes will go down in history as some of the vilest, most depraved acts ever investigated.
Gerard John Schaefer is the epitome of an evil monster. When I look into his eyes, the man has no soul. He has no conscience.